The author of Chasdei David continues to summarize the teachings of the Arizal with several more insights regarding the vessels and the spiritual lights that make up the Sefirot and the Partzufim. Ve'akelim nechlakim lipnimi vechitzon. And the vessels are divided into two parts, internal vessels and external vessels. Ve'achitzon gadol me'apenimi. And the external vessels are greater than the internal vessels. Ve'ha'orot nechelakim lipnimi umekif. And the spiritual lights are also divided into two parts, internal light and surrounding light. Ve'ha'makiv gadol me'apenimi. And here too, the external surrounding light is greater than the internal light. In this session, we are introduced to several more divisions and qualifications. First, with regards to the spiritual vessels that make up every Sefirah and every Partzuf, and then with regards to the spiritual lights that these vessels contain. The very first qualification that we learn has to do with the vessels. Indeed, each and every vessel is made up of an internal part as well as an external part, what the Arizal technically calls the internal vessel and the external vessel. And although in our last session we already clarified that in truth it is certainly impossible to illustrate a real image of the spiritual vessels, nevertheless, according to the previous simulation that we offered in order to give us at least some understanding of the concept called spiritual vessels, we'll now proceed to, so to speak, divide our spiritual vessel into the two parts that we mention here. First, the internal part of the vessel, which we'll be calling the internal vessel, and then the external part of the vessel, which we'll be calling the external vessel. After distinguishing between the internal and the external parts of the vessels, the author continues to clarify that the external vessel is actually greater than the internal vessel. But what do we mean when we say that the external vessel is greater than the internal vessel? By using a term like greater than, do we actually mean to suggest that there are dimensions in the spiritual worlds? Certainly not. But rather, the Arizal actually means to impress upon us that the external vessel is more purified and therefore greater in a spiritual sense than the internal vessel. What could we compare this to? Perhaps we could compare this phenomenon to the physical vessels that we use down here in the physical world. After all, more often than not, the external part of our cups, such as our Kiddush cups and our coffee cups, are decorated with different colors and shapes, much more than the internal part of these cups that hold the liquids that tend to stain their interior, as we know. Inasmuch, we shouldn't be surprised that the external part of the spiritual vessel is also greater than the internal part of the vessel. Now, the author shifts our focus to the spiritual lights of the Sefirot and the Partzufim, as they are also divided into two subdivisions. The first part of the spiritual lights is the internal light. And as you can see in the simulation before you, this part of the light is called internal for the fact that it is appropriately positioned inside of the vessel. On the other hand, the other part of the light, which is the external surrounding light, is appropriately called surrounding light for the fact that it is positioned outside of the vessel, or more accurately, surrounding the vessel. And you should know that in the writings of the Arizal, we find that when the spiritual lights wish to enter their vessel, the vessel can only contain the three lowest levels of light, which are the Nefesh, and the Ruach, and the Neshama. However, the two highest levels of light, which are called the Chaya and the Yechidah, cannot be contained by the vessel, and therefore they must remain outside of the vessel, surrounding it from the outside. After all, even though the Chaya and the Yechidah remain outside of the vessel, they nevertheless gravitate towards their respective part of the vessel, not unlike the way that a satellite remains pulled towards the Earth, even though it actually surrounds it. And according to what we just clarified from the writings of the Arizal, we should understand very well why the author tells us here that the surrounding light is greater than the internal light. After all, we just mentioned that the surrounding light is comprised of the Chaya and the Yechidah, which, as we learned, are the two highest levels of light. On the other hand, we also learned that the internal light is comprised of the Nefesh and the Ruach and the Neshama, which are the three lowest levels of light. Based on that, the author stated that the surrounding light is greater than the internal light. And before we proceed onwards, I'd like to bring to your attention how in the terminology of the Arizal, we refer to the external part of the vessel as the external vessel, while the external part of the spiritual light is called the surrounding light and not the external light. And although there seemingly isn't much difference between surrounding light and external light, nevertheless, the sooner that we become acquainted with the terminology of the Arizal, the better. Now, the author of Chasdei David signs off section 1 of his summary of the teachings of the Arizal with the following insights. והפנימי מאיר חצי עובי של הכלי מצד פנים. And the internal light illuminates the inner half of the vessel's thickness. יען נכנס ומתלבש בתוכו. Since the internal light enters inside the vessel and becomes enveloped inside of it. והמקיף מאיר חצי עובי של הכלי מצד חוץ. On the other hand, the external light illuminates the external thickness of the vessel from the outside. These words are obviously very, very deep. Therefore, we'll have to break things down and clarify them one step at a time. After teaching us that both the vessels and the spiritual lights that they contain are divided into two private subdivisions, namely the internal and outer vessels, as well as the internal and surrounding lights, now the author continues to clarify that there is actually a very intimate connection between the vessels and their spiritual lights. Or more accurately, between each part of the vessel and its respective part of the light. According to that, we learn here that the internal light illuminates the inner half of the vessel's thickness from the inside. In other words, the internal light illuminates the internal vessel, which after all represents the inner half of the vessel's entire thickness. And the reason for this phenomenon is clear. Since the internal light enters the vessel and is therefore enveloped by it from the inside. But in order to impress upon us the great secret that we just learned here, I therefore simulated the two parts of the vessel, the internal vessel situated inside of the external vessel, and I also simulated how the internal light is positioned inside of the internal vessel. However, you should know that what you currently see is the stage before the internal light began to illuminate the internal vessel. But now we'll proceed to simulate the stage that the author described, as the internal light illuminates the internal vessel since it enters it from the inside and becomes enveloped by it. And as you can see before you, the internal vessel is becoming brighter and brighter, as the internal light affects it from the inside and therefore makes it more and more refined. Now we'll switch our focus to the external vessel. What you currently see before you is a simulation of the surrounding light positioned around the external vessel. And here too, the author informs us that the surrounding light illuminates and thereby refines the external thickness of the vessel, i.e., the external vessel. And in order to impress the secret upon you, I therefore simulated how the external vessel is becoming brighter and brighter, so to speak, as it becomes more and more refined by the surrounding light from the outside. And of course, it goes without saying that what I just demonstrated for you is only a simulation, as no one knows how the vessels and their spiritual lights actually look like. Nevertheless, with the help of our simulation, we're able to attain at least some impression of what the Arizal really wanted to communicate to us, although by no means is our simulation literal. And you should know that in his book Etz Chaim, the Arizal clarifies that the reason why the internal and surrounding lights illuminate and refine the vessels, one from the inside and the other from the outside, is because the internal light is considered to be a female aspect, while the surrounding light is considered to be a male aspect. And you're probably asking yourselves, what could the Arizal possibly mean with that statement? Well, if you remember, earlier on we learned that the internal light is comprised of the three lowest parts of the light, namely the Nefesh, the Ruach, and the Neshama. Meanwhile, the external part of the light is comprised of the two highest levels of light, namely the Chaya and the Yechidah. And when we look even closer, we'll notice that the highest part of the internal light is the Neshama, while the lowest part of the surrounding light is the Chaya. If so, then it actually comes out that the dividing point between the internal light and the surrounding light is between the Neshama on the inside and the Chaya on the outside. With that in mind, the Arizal clarifies in Etz Chaim that the relationship between the Neshama and the Chaya is synonymous with the relationship between Partzuf Abba and Partzuf Ima. If so, then we find that the dividing point between the internal light and the surrounding light could be described as the mark that divides between the part of the light that is equivalent to Abba, i.e. the male on the outside, and the part of the light that is equivalent to Ima, i.e. the female on the inside. Having clarified all of that, we should now be able to appreciate that since the male aspect of this partnership is positioned inside of the vessel, while the female aspect of this partnership is positioned outside of the vessel, therefore it is only natural that both the male and the female sides of this partnership yearn to reunite with their natural partner. However, since the thickness of the vessel obviously stands in between them, therefore, in order to overcome this obstacle, each one of them proceeds to illuminate and thereby refine the part of the vessel that is closest to them, the female from the inside and the male from the outside. And by doing so, the female aspect of the light enters the vessel till the center point of the vessel from the inside, while the male aspect of the light enters the vessel till its center point from the outside. And there, in the very center of the vessel's thickness, the male and the female aspects of the light reunite. Ashreichem Yisrael! Fortunate are you, the nation of Israel, if you merited to attain an understanding of the incredible secret that the Arizal revealed to us here. And in case you still haven't grasped this last point, I'll ask of you to please rewind and replay these last few minutes of film over and over until these words enter your heart and allow you to see them in the eye of your mind. And since with this last insight we have completed learning together section 1 of Chasdei David's summary of the Arizal's teachings, I'll therefore take this chance to thank the Almighty for the opportunity to learn together with my viewers till this point. And at the same time, I'll pray to the Almighty that He should merit us to continue to explain and to simulate the great secrets that the Arizal revealed to the world, be it with the rest of Chasdei David's summary of the Arizal's words, and eventually with the Arizal's writings themselves. But of course, everything in its right time. May the Almighty enlighten our eyes with the words of His Holy Torah. Amen ve'amen.